e4, c6, d4, d5. Congratulations. You are now playing the usual Caro-Kann defense. But the real question is, do you know how to play this? Well, if you don't, I'm here to help you sharpen your mind in playing this Caro-Kann defense. The complicated theory make it easier for you by just understanding the main purpose and mission of each pieces, when to push them, when to maneuver them, and when to sacrifice them. Your opponent play e4 the king's pawn, then instead of pushing back to e5, you push c6 to make things complicated. Just kidding. You push c6, the Caro-Kann defense. Most of the time, your opponent responds d4 trying to control the center. Of course we response d5 attacking this pawn. After this, your opponent has a lot of options, but let's only analyze with 4 common response of white here. So let's take a look. Let's start with the advanced variation, which is advancing pawn to e5, an idea of controlling this 2 squares. Look at your pieces, some of them can't be developed yet. Pushing e6 can create a strong pawn structure, but the problem is your bishop is stuck. Your knight is also blocked. That's why the best to move is bishop to f5. If your opponent move bishop to d3, just take. After he take back with queen, you can now push e6. If your opponent develop his knight rather than the bishop first, just still push e6. So, if they push c3 to have a strong pawn structure, then still push e6. And what if they develop their knight on c3 or d2? What is the next move? Yes, you're right. Push e6. Always remember, after getting out the bishop, you can now push e6, with an idea also of opening this diagonal and possibly develop the bishop later. The next common response for white here is bishop e2 supporting its knight and avoiding the pin of bishop. Then, push c5 with the idea of destroying the center pawn and having a square for the knight and queen. If they take, well, it's a good thing because it will not only capture back and develop our bishop easily but also destroy the opponent's central pawn. What if they don't take but instead they support with bishop? Then get out our queen to b6, adding pressure to the opponent. If they take, we can just take back and develop our 2 knights pressuring the isolated pawn in e5 square. But if they don't take it, instead they develop their knight. We can see the b2 pawn is free, but don't take that as it can possibly fall you into a trap, because after you take it, they just place their queen on b2 to defend, then knight is free. That's why you take it. Then there is just bishop d2 to defend, and your queen is almost trapped. The only square to escape is the a3 square. After you move, an easy take on b7 and control the 7th rank file. This is already a great advantage for white. That's why instead of taking b2, develop your knight on c6 to add pressure. Then let's say they capture it, takes. Then we can rotate our knight here to pressure this isolated pawn on e5. That's already a slight advantage for us. Now let's review. Get out your queen if they are defending it with a bishop, and if they only castle, our knight will develop instead of queen. That's it. Let's go back to this position. We have another choice to move here, which is instead of bishop to c5, we move c5 directly, challenging the opponent's central pawn and trying to destroy it directly. The plan is to let the knight into a square. Let's assume that they actually take it. In that case, let's advance our knight and apply pressure to the e5 pawn. Then the opponent develops their knight to protect and support the pawn. Then let's develop our bishop pinning the knight. By moving their bishop to e2, they might also cover the pin. The missions I previously taught you are still applicable after this. Push e6 to create a strong pawn structure and allow the bishop to open the diagonal after developing the bishop. Assume they advance their bishop and provide help for their pawn here or here. If they go to e3 supporting this pawn, you can't take with bishop, then develop your knight here to attack the bishop, and if it goes on f4 then just simply take the pawn. Let's say they move on e3 defending this pawn, then develop our knight in planning of attacking this bishop. If the opponent move h3, then simply take knight. I suggest you not to take it directly, take it only if it's necessary. Just keep your other pieces developed first. So, after they take it back, then take the free pawn. Develop the knight next, capture this pawn if possible, and then castle. It is already a slight advantage for us. Now that the advanced variation has been completed, let's examine the exchange variation. The exchange variation is significantly simpler because there isn't an advanced pawn in this square, so you can freely develop your pieces. So after they take, just take back, and they may develop their knight to support its pawn, then develop your knight. Develop there another knight, then put your bishop here or here, and let's say you choose to pin. The typical white to move in this situation is bishop e2 supporting the knight, then still push e6. The objective remains the same, to establish a solid pawn structure and to open the diagonal for the bishop's development. This situation is nearly identical to the earlier advanced variation. The only thing that differs is that you can develop quickly and your knight can develop on the f6 file. That's why this variation is much easier. If they castle to secure their king, develop your bishop here or here, but I highly suggest to put it on d6 or develop your knight in f6. And if they move h3, you can take or just go back on h5. Let's say you take it, then they take back, you can now develop the bishop here or here. If they probably pin, just castle, then they move the best move, room e1. We can't attack yet with our queen because of pin, that's why we attack using our pawn on h6. If they push back, attack again and they back again. Then it is the time to exchange it with our bishop to have an opponent isolated pawn. Then we can now attack using our queen and b6 square. This is already a great advantage for us after this. Let's go back in this position. What if they don't move bishop e2, instead pin on your knight in b5? Then just attack with a6. If they take, then take back. You still have a good pawn structure. And if they push c4 to attack and destroy central pawn, then you can just develop your knight to support the pawn and keep on developing. If they take, then just take back. And if they do not, let's say they just develop their knight, then just pin it with bishop. Push e6. Castle and connect your rooks. Then time for attack. We are done analyzing the two most common moves after d5, the advance variation and the exchange variation. Then let's analyze the other common response after d5, moving the knight on c3, intended to pressure the pawn on d5. Just take the pawn, then they take back, develop your knight, and if they capture, then take it back with the pawn. You have a double pawn, but that's still okay. Then they might develop their knight, instead of pinning it directly with bishop. Develop your other bishop first in order to castle and secure your king to avoid possible attack of white because e-file is open. Place the rook in open file. Then if they move h3 to avoid pin, then develop your bishop in e6 since you can't go on f5. Then develop your knight until it reaches f8 to support the h7 pawn. Then you can go your queen on d7 or c7 to have an attack. And now let's analyze a little bit the best counter for the Caro-Kann defense, and you must also be ready with this, especially if you're an intermediate player, which is the Caro-Kann defense, fantasy variation. You can also check this out in my previous video for more detailed analysis. So, instead of advancing pawn on d5, or exchanging pawn on d5 or pushing knight on c3, this is pushing pawn on c3, creates a solid pawn structure. You can also counter this, since this bishop is blocked with pawns, it means e6 may the possible square to develop, but you can't push your pawn and your other bishop is also blocked. Developing your knight here is not also a good idea, that's why push e5. If they take, you can't take back, that's why develop your bishop here. If they are greedy to take your other pawn, then develop your queen, intended to attack in this diagonal, their knight must be moved. If not, then we can win a piece, and if it move e2, then check on f2, no other square to move than a beautiful queen to e3, checkmate. So, if they are trying to defend it with another pawn, just take e4, and if they take back, queen h6 check, and if it covers with pawn, then check again on e4 with fork. That are some of the counter of fantasy variation, that's it. Since we already covered the 4 common responses of white after d5, always remember that it is not all of the time that the showing move I show you is really the move that your opponent move in an actual game. That's why I show you an actual game using this opening.